Okay, welcome to this Thesis Theater. Before we start, if you want to type away in the chat, say hi to each other and comment on what's going on in the Thesis Theater, please feel free to do so, but make sure you've got it set to everyone so that everyone can see what you're saying. Otherwise, it might just bounce to the hosts and panelists and I might not notice what you're saying. The other thing is that if you have questions for Kimberly, please could you try and remember to put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat, because sometimes things get lost in the chat. But other than that, I think we are ready to go. You ready to go, Kimberly?
I believe so. Thank you.
All right. So, as I said, welcome all to this Thesis Theatre with Kimberly McKinney. And I will start just by telling you a little bit about Kimberly before we get into the wonderful work that she has been doing on her thesis. An avid reader from an early age, Kimberly studied biology and journalism in college with plans to become a science writer. In time, however, the writing side won out and she began pursuing a part-time career as a book editor while embarking on a full-time career of homeschooling her children. In 2021, she joined the Signum family in the MA program to expand her knowledge of language and literature, especially fantasy literature, and to sharpen her abilities to communicate and to teach. Her interests span a broad range, including the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, medieval Germanic languages, and modern methods of textual study. Kimberly and her husband have also authored and self-published a growing number of fantasy novels together. She lives with her family and, delightfully, 4 cats in South Carolina, USA. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you very much.
So I'm really excited to talk to you about the work that you have done on your thesis. But the first thing I would like you to do, if you would, is to give us a brief overview of your thesis. And I believe you have a presentation to offer.
All right. Yes. I would say, in essence, my thesis asks, since everyone says Tolkien really liked plants a lot, how do we know that? I wanted to look at what Tolkien said about plants. And more importantly to me, I wanted to know, how does that affect his storytelling?
Right.
Where can we see plants coming through? So I started based on the idea of my previous readings of Tolkien that plants seem to be associated with good things. And so I started with that idea and then branched out to see what other uses plants have in symbolism, in communication of major themes. So that's basically what we're going to be talking about today.
Fantastic. Right. I think you have a PowerPoint that you're going to share with us. Is that right?
I do indeed.
Okay. I'm going to let you do that, and then I'm going to let you give your presentation. And while you're doing that, I'm going to turn off my camera so that people only look at you and not at me.
All right. So let me share. All right. And there we go.
Perfect.
All right, let me see here. It seems to have selected the wrong slide.
Ooh,
So give me one moment.
not a problem.
Technology. All right. Here we go. That looks better.
Yes, just want to make it full screen and then you can get going.
And it's still there. We are. All right. All right. Well, it is my privilege to share with you all today the topic that I have thoroughly enjoyed studying for this thesis, which is how J.R.R. Tolkien's use of plants supports, shapes, and strengthens his storytelling in Middle-earth. Tolkien's fictional writing about the fantastical land of Middle-earth is tree-like itself, rooted in his own imagination and sprawling outward to encompass the stories that gave shape to his great tale. Those who have read much of Tolkien will recall how often trees and many other plants appear as key components of these stories, and Tolkien's letters confirm for us the depth of affection that he bore toward the living green world. But Tolkien was also concerned with how stories are told, and in his essay on fairy stories, he coined the term eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe, to name the sudden turn to the joyful ending that he believed marked the best of all fairy stories. Eucatastrophes can never be expected, but that only makes them more joyful when they occur. The possibility of a better ending also drives some characters to pursue their goals, even when faced with great hardship. Tolkien created a word for this, too, Estel, an Elvish word translated either as hope or trust, but meaning a profound hope, one that comes from deep in the soul. What may not be obvious at first is how often these themes come together. The high value that Tolkien placed on plants moved him to frame them in active roles and to use them to communicate some of his most significant themes. Today, I want to explore 4 key ways that Tolkien used plants in Middle-earth: in setting environment and mood, in indicating the good or evil of a location, in instigating eucatastrophe, and in symbolizing abiding hope. Tolkien's appreciation for nature, and particularly for plants, is well known. It began in his childhood, growing up in rural England, which became the inspiration for the agricultural land of the Shire. And here he started to develop his understanding of botany that later allowed him to reference plants accurately and in detail. But Tolkien also presented nature as very much its own entity, living, feeling, and changing, just as the beings within it do. To cite just one example, the mountain Caradhras does not wish to be crossed by the Fellowship and spitefully fights against them. Tolkien viewed the botanical members of the living world as independent beings deserving of respect. As he says through Goldberry to the hobbits, the trees and the grasses and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves. Tolkien designed Middle-earth to be a mythological prehistory to our own world. By including dozens of familiar species of plants and fungi, Tolkien linked the visual and sensory experiences of the characters to those of his readers. When Bilbo views a towering pine, we can immediately understand what he sees. Middle-earth is long removed from our time, but not from our living world. Tolkien also crafted several fictional botanicals of his own, some with special characteristics that make them stand out from their more mundane relatives. Some of these invented plants show up rarely in the legendarium, but others play important roles in how Tolkien used plants in both Eucatastrophe and Estel. How the peoples of Middle-earth respond to plants, what we might call Middle-earth ecological and environmental concerns, has also been a subject of interest in Tolkien scholarship in recent years. The books Ents, Elves, and Eriador, The Environmental Vision of J.R.R. Tolkien, categorizes these into 3 environmental approaches: agriculture, or an imposed order on natural growth, exemplified by the hobbits; horticulture, an aesthetic ordering of natural environments as practiced by the elves; and thirdly, fericulture, or the preservation of natural wildness, the strategy pursued by the Ents. By including many scientifically accessible plant species, by creating novel plant species, and by exploring ecological strategies, Tolkien gives his fictional world a vivid lifelikeness and demonstrates his personal love for all things botanical. Tolkien's concern for plants is also demonstrated by how he used them to set up scenes. Not only does Tolkien include plant species appropriate to Northern Europe, which is the primary world equivalent of the parts of Middle-earth in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, but he also selects only species that match a scene's specific environment. The hobbits, the narrators of the stories, are familiar with the local flora, a familiarity that fades the farther they go from home. The frequency of botanically related names in the Shire also shows the agricultural mindset of the hobbits, and how carefully Tolkien selected names to match culture. Such choices reveal his understanding of traditional plant lore as well. For example, the rose, which names Sam Gamgee's faithful sweetheart Rosie Cotton, has long symbolized love and devotion. Gorse, a thorny, unpleasant flowering plant, is mentioned in relation to the destroyed region of Moria and the destitute Mordor. Water lilies, a signature flower of Tom Bombadil and Goldberry, are a traditional symbol of purity and are used in herbal treatments, correlating to the rest and refreshing that the hobbits experienced during their stay in Bombadil's house. Further, the plant life of the regions of Middle-earth reflect on how we are to feel about those environments. The beautiful Green Shire leaves us feeling, as Tolkien did, that a thoughtfully tended countryside would be a truly idyllic place to call home. And we are as grieved and shocked as Sam when the Shire is broken and loses its botanical beauty. The forests of Middle-earth are especially worthy of notice, and perhaps worthy of a healthy dose of trepidation. The dark, dangerous forest of Mirkwood, the Old Forest, and Fangorn Forest challenge us with a very real possibility that by merely existing as non-plant living beings in the realm of the trees, we have entered a perilous place. Another forest, however, stands out as a place of security and refreshment, and that is Lothlorien. In the Golden Wood, the Fellowship do not experience threats of the normal perilous wood sort, but rather rest, consolation, and counsel. They receive gifts that in one instance will later become a source of renewed hope and joy. Also, the land of Ithilien, between Gondor and Mordor, provides a setting that is startling in its botanical beauty and encouraging in its resistance toward evil. Frodo and Sam find their spirits greatly lifted by the sight of flowers, herbs, and trees in Ithilien. After their quest is fulfilled, Ithilien again serves as a garden of healing for the two weary hobbits. Sam's first conscious thoughts are of the plant life and aromas that he recalls with joy, standing in sharp contrast to the ruined land of Mordor that he has just left. But consider also the extended roles that plants play in Middle-earth. First, we see how Tolkien used plants to portray the good, by their flourishing, or the evil, by their withering, of the lands in his stories. In The Hobbit, when Bilbo and the dwarfs have set out from Lake Town for the Lonely Mountain, a dismaying reality greets them. The lush green home of the dwarfs has been transformed into a bleak wilderness where only scraggly grass can grow. What is the cause of such devastation? This is the desolation of the dragon. The evil of Smaug has ruined the valley, and Tolkien shows us this by describing the struggling plant life. Mordor is worse. The Black Land has been deeply marred by Sauron's presence. Mordor is not entirely devoid of plants, but the few that gasp out in existence there are strangled, blackened, and riddled with thorns and pests. Tolkien paints a picture for us of how a place could reach such a state by giving us the story of Isengard. As Gandalf, Aragorn, and others approach Saruman's tower after the Battle of Helm's Deep, Tolkien recounts that once it had been green and filled with avenues and groves of fruitful trees, but no green thing grew there in the latter days of Saruman. Again, we ask what has brought about such a change, and again the answer comes in the admittance of evil. Saruman, in his growing lust for power, has come to view the living things around him as nothing more than disposable tools. But if the withering and absence of plants shows evil, the opposite is also true. Where Tolkien wants to give the impression of good, we find abundant plant life. This tie goes all the way back to the beginning of Tolkien's mythology. In the land of Valinor, Yavanna Sub creates trees and other plants, and Ermo cares for them in his gardens. While describing the blessed realm, Tolkien emphasizes the plants that grow there to give us a grand and glowing picture of what a perfect world would look like. And here, Tolkien also introduces his greatest enabling of trees, the tree herding and tree resembling Ents, the shepherds of the forest. The elven forest of Lothlorien reflects this same cherishing of plants. The members of the Fellowship draw comfort and hope from the plants of Lothlorien as well. For example, upon seeing the Elanor and Nifredel flowers on Caranamroth, Aragorn recalls the joy of the day when he and Arden were betrothed at that location. And Frodo is awestruck by touching a single one of Lothlorien's trees and suddenly feeling himself connected to it as a small part of a grander world. The singularly significant White Tree of Gondor parallels the well-being of the Kingdom of Gondor itself. Rescued from the destruction of Numenor by Elendil and his sons, and planted in hope in their new homeland, the White Tree is a powerful symbol of the waning of Gondor as it decays alongside the light of the king, and then of the future joy that awaits the renewed kingdom when its sapling blooms again in Aragorn's court. So at last we come back to Tolkien's potent concept of eucatastrophe. the sudden turn and the piercing glimpse of joy, as he called it, at the moment when despair gives way to a realized hope. Tolkien utilized his beloved plants in telling some of Middle-earth's great eucatastrophes. Based on his faith in the Christian gospel, Tolkien desired to infuse sudden joyous change into his fictional tales. Eucatastrophe, as Tolkien makes clear, is not the absence of sadness, nor of the possibility of discatastrophe, which he defined as sorrow and failure. Rather, eucatastrophe means that the tale achieves a happy ending despite darkness, providing the reader with consolation that sorrow can give way to joy. Several important eucatastrophes are intertwined with plants. After the withering of the two trees of Valinor, the light contained in the trees was preserved only in Feanor's jewels, the Silmarils. Through the Silmarils, that light passed to the crown of Morgoth, to the hand of Beren, to the brow of Erendil, to the mirror and phial of Galadriel, and finally to the hands of Frodo and Sam in the tunnels of Shelob. There is no reason to believe a little hobbit could stand against a skilled huntress in her own lair, but Tolkien provides a startling answer in giving Sam a botanically sourced light that defies the darkness itself. The discatastrophe of the first event leads directly to the eucatastrophe of the second, by the light of the two trees. Again, we see the White Tree of Gondor, whose very existence depends on unlikely rescue. Sauron intended to destroy Nimloth, the White Tree of Numenor, but Isildur managed to save a single one of its fruits, nearly at the cost of his own life. The new White Tree was brought to Middle-earth in Isildur's ship that barely escaped the drowning of Numenor. By these unexpected turns of events, an important symbol of hope and light is kept alive. Long years later, in The Hobbit, Bilbo will experience some plant-related eucatastrophes of his own. After escaping the Goblin Caves, Bilbo and the dwarves find themselves destitute, pursued, and desperate to get away from the mountains. But they instead get caught in a landslide, from which Tolkien delivers them by the presence of trees, behind or in which they hide. They scramble up trees to escape the goblins and wargs, which the narrator informs us also stopped the goblin raid that had been planned for that night. Later, the trees of Mirkwood enable Bilbo's eucatastrophic rescue of his dwarven friends when they are captured by giant spiders. As an elven forest, Mirkwood sets the right atmosphere to embolden Bilbo to complete his quest. He also utilizes the nature of the forest, namely its many trees and branches, to lead the spiders away and dodge their attacks. Another example of eucatastrophe comes in another dark forest. When Frodo, Merry, Pippin, and Sam enter the Old Forest, they are captured by the dangerous Old Man Willow. Just when their situation seems hopeless, Tolkien brings in deliverance in the form of the enigmatic Tom Bombadil, who bears a strong association with the natural world in its purest form. By their restraining yet cultivating presence, Tom and Goldberry serve both as voices for the plant life of the Old Forest and as a source of eucatastrophe for the hobbits. But the Forest of Fangorn holds Tolkien's most prominent plant-based eucatastrophes, featuring his greatest plant creations, the tree-shepherding Ents and the semi-sentient Huorns. Treebeard embodies Tolkien's desire to speak for the trees and to defend their place as an integral part of their surroundings. So it is poignant that Tolkien uses the Ents and the Huorns to enable the remarkable victory over Saruman's attack on Rohan. When Saruman rips down Fangorn's trees and pillages the green fields of the Rohirrim, the Ents march against the stronghold of Isengard, bringing Saruman to just punishment for his crimes against the natural world, and especially against the trees. Further, the trees of Fangorn rise to their own defense. The Huorns are mysterious, quite possibly deliberately on Tolkien's part, but their silent and powerful attack against the orcs at Helm's Deep finishes the battle with botanical heroes. Gandalf honors the trees for their help, calling it a thing beyond the counsel of the wise and better than his hope. A final plant-related eucatastrophe that we will consider comes at the end of the Quest of the Ring, when the hobbits return to their homeland. There they discover the horror Saruman has afflicted on their beloved Shire, a ravaging of all its trees and gardens. Much like the Ents, the hobbits band together and fight back for their homes. But despite their victory, the devastation to the once green landscape distresses Sam greatly. Here, Tolkien weaves in another sudden turn in the form of Sam's gift from Galadriel, soil from her garden in Lothlorien, and the single Malorn tree seed. The virtue of the Elvish tree brings about a miraculous restoration in the Shire, and bounty the likes of which the hobbits have never seen before. Tolkien's plants, in Sam's hands and touched by elven power, create unparalleled eucatastrophic joy in the restoration of the hobbit's home. A world where eucatastrophe can happen is a world in which hope can exist. Tolkien once spoke of hope in very botanical terms in a letter to his son Christopher in 1944. Evil labors with vast power and perpetual success, in vain, preparing always only the soil for unexpected good to sprout in. But there is still some hope that things may be better for us, even on the temporal plane, in the mercy of God. Evil may be prevalent in Middle-earth, but Tolkien also allowed for hope, which he called in Elvish, Estel. Estel is primarily communicated through action, but in the Athrabeth, the elf Finrod discusses it explicitly. Amdir, we call it, looking up, but there is another hope which is founded deeper. Estel, we call it, that is trust. It is not defeated by the ways of the world, for it does not come from experience, but from our nature and first being. Of all his designs, the issue must be for his children's joy. The Elvish concept of hope, Tolkien's concept, links it directly back to the notion of joy. Finrod also contrasts two types of hope, Amdir, a shallower wish or desire, and Estel, an abiding trust that a better future is possible. Tolkien uses the word hope in both these senses, but interestingly, the deeper hope of Estel may be found around several plant-related characters and situations. Gandalf speaks of his own personal hope, even as the darkest shadows of Mordor fall, in terms of the blossoming and fruiting of a new generation of plants. In the forest of Lothlorien, the Fellowship show the depth of their Estel, as they unanimously decide to forsake the possibility of giving up after the loss of their leader and press onward in their quest to destroy the One Ring. Some of our previously mentioned most botanical places experience a resurgence of joy and hope as the story draws to a close. Mirkwood is freed from Sauron's presence and becomes Greenwood the Great again, home of the Wood Elves. Similarly, Ithilien, the Garden of Gondor, is purged of Mordor's influence and serves as Frodo and Sam's healing place, as well as the future home of Faramir and Éowyn, where it will be restored to the fullness of its former beauty. And the Shire itself, so damaged by the end of the narrative, will also be swept up in the touch of elven power that Sam's Malorn tree is able to bring to the Hobbit's homeland. Besides locations, individual characters can hold close associations with both plants and with hope. First, there's Aragorn, whose childhood nickname was Tolkien's word for hope, Stel. Aragorn is the hope for the restoration of the kingdom of Gondor, symbolized by the white tree. He draws hope from the sight of the flowers of Lenor and Nifredel in Lothlorien, remembering his and Arwen's pledges to marry one day. In hope, he utilizes herbs, in particular Tolkien's fictional herb Athlas, to heal his sick and injured friends. He pursues Merry and Pippin into Fangorn Forest in hope of recovering them from their captors. Aragorn, the source and practitioner of many hopes, is likewise associated with many plants. But even more clearly, Samwise Gamgee, the lowly hobbit gardener, stands out as one with persistent, enduring hope. Once at Galadriel's mirror, and once in the barren plains of Morgoth, Sam is challenged to give up the quest and pursue his desire to save the trees, both of which he refuses in favor of a happier ending. After the ring is destroyed and Sam stands again in a damaged Shire, he steadfastly promises himself to work to replant and regrow its lost beauty for future generations to enjoy. To finish our study, let me mention some individual plants that are symbols of hope. One of them is not even named. But as Frodo and Sam tread through Ithilien, they stumble across the broken statue of a king, around which a small vining plant with white flowers has entwined itself. The floral crown on the king's head momentarily fills Frodo with hope, and he cries out, "They cannot conquer forever." Frodo's life, as well as those of Merry, Faramir, and Éowyn, are also delivered by a simple plant, the herb Athelas. Athelas heals each of these characters, following the encounters each has with the evil Nazgul. This reflects the traditional role of plants in medicine, but Tolkien elevates medicinal herbs by giving Athelas the ability to heal both body and mind. Two individual trees also serve in this tale as powerful symbols of hope. First, the Malorn tree Galadriel gives to Sam, which he plants in place of the felled party tree above Bag End. The whole land reaps the reward of Sam's committed hope that caused him to persevere and hold on to that little box, even when tangible hope had met its end. Lastly, we return again to the white tree of Gondor. Though Faramir has never seen a living white tree, he still regards it as the symbol of all of his hope for his country, and he accepts Aragorn as bearer of the standard of the white tree, as the fulfillment of hope for the renewal of the Gondorian kingship. Aragorn, too, looks to the white tree as a sign of hope. Above Minas Tirith, Gandalf and Aragorn find that against all odds, a sapling white tree has sprouted incalculable years after a fruit was carried there. The sapling grows quickly and bears flowers, the signal he was awaiting that the blossoming of his deepest hopes for his marriage to Arwen and the establishment of his kingdom and his house have finally come to fruition. Tolkien loved green and growing things, and Tolkien loved fairy stories, whose greatest end he perceived to be the eucatastrophe that brings hope to realization. These themes coincide in a consistent and persistent pattern throughout Middle-earth. Tolkien possessed a deep knowledge of plants, and through their presence or absence, he provides glimpses of good or evil in the landscape of his tales. Middle-earth's plants may carry out the sudden joy of eucatastrophe, given a value and an agency not often afforded to plant life. And they may symbolize the promise and fulfillment of the deeply cherished hope of Estel. For Tolkien, plants play a complex and integral role in both the setting and the meaning of his stories, where they help him communicate the intangible realities of joy and hope. Let me take one moment to refer you to the various references I have used today, and to also thank the Tolkien estate for providing for all of us to enjoy these beautiful artworks that Tolkien created of plants. Thank you so much for listening in today.
That was lovely. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Okay,
You're
if you
welcome.
mind stopping sharing.
Will do.
Perfect. Okay. All right, everybody. So if you have any questions for Kimberly, do feel free to pop them into the Q&A and I will get to them. But while you're having a good old think about what she's just been telling you about, let's start, Kimberly, by
Yes.
letting folks know how and why you chose this particular topic.
Yes. You mentioned earlier that I have a background in biology. That was my undergraduate work. And so basically I decided with that background, it would be just a lot of fun to look at some biology aspects of Tolkien. So I wanted to do something with either plants or animals. I knew that. So I started rereading the Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings, and just marked down every reference to plants or animals that I could find. There were a lot, especially plants. So it struck me that one, plants were an abundant source of material that I could use. And two, plants showed up a lot associated with good characters, good places, positive things. So I became curious about how Tolkien used his plants in his storytelling, and especially how plant-associated characters were involved in eucatastrophes. And as I studied that out some more, it became apparent to me that eucatastrophic joy and the idea of hope were really closely linked. And so all of the pieces started falling into place for what I've talked about today.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love the fact that you were able to draw on a background of knowledge from well outside of Signum to help you to focus on the topic that you wanted to do with the stuff that you did do in Signum. So that's absolutely wonderful. I love to see it when we can actually do all those kinds of
It was
crossover.
a great synthesis. I really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. Well, I have to say, I really enjoyed reading it. So it was a delightful, I'm telling you, everybody, it was a delightful thesis to read. So let's talk about some of the things that you briefly mentioned in your presentation, some of the things that you expand on in the thesis itself. You said that Ents are Tolkien's greatest enabling of trees. So could you expand a little for us on the role or the roles that you believe the Ents take on in Middle-earth?
Oh, sure. Ents are really fascinating to me. They're one of my favorites. There's not much like them out there in fantasy literature.
Mm,
And we don't get a lot of information about them until we get to suddenly Treebeard's here in The Lord of the Rings. Who is this? Their origins are very briefly mentioned in the Silmarillion, but we don't really get to find out much about them until the Two Towers.
right.
And so as characters, Ents, I think, are really powerful in Tolkien because it's hard to think of a greater way that Tolkien could have taken the side of the trees, as he says in one of his letters, to create sentient tree beings. So they're tree-like in their appearance. They're tree-like in the way they participate with the world. They're standing in the world, they're alongside the world, but they really don't interact with it until it's interacting with them.
That's an excellent point.
And so they also clearly speak for plants and come to their defense when they march against Isengard. It's really because Saruman's been cutting down their trees, and
Hmm.
they're deeply concerned about his interference. So I talked in my a few minutes ago about the very direct way Tolkien uses them in Eucatastrophe, so when they come to the defense of Rohan and fight against Isengard. But I also found that they were rather symbolic of hope, especially toward the very end of The Lord of the Rings. They are actively working to restore Isengard for future generations. We know from some things Treebeard says that their own future as a race is very uncertain,
Hmm.
and they don't know how much longer they're going to be in Middle-earth, but they're the first to come and try to restore Middle-earth. Um, so it's a lot. It reminded me a lot of how plants are like the first living things to return after a wildfire or another disaster comes through. What do you see first? It's these little green sprouts, right? The plants are coming back. So in the ends, it seems to me that Tolkien gives us a microcosm of what Middle-earth could be and really what our world could be if we show respect toward nature and try to work in harmony with it.
Yeah, I really like that. And your analogy about after destruction, like fire, for example, I think that's a really great analogy there because it doesn't seem to matter what we humans do. In the end, nature is just fighting back constantly, which I think is a good thing because we do seem to
Yes.
be doing our darndest to destroy as much of nature as possible, but to see it coming back no matter what is always, for me anyway, quite uplifting.
Yes, yes, I would agree.
Mm. And talking of uplifting, let's look at your thesis title.
Mhm.
It mentions themes of joy and hope. Can you explain for us a little bit how you see these two themes as relating to one another in Tolkien's fiction? And I'll say why, because I think it is pretty much agreed that the main theme of Tolkien's work is death and loss. So it's fascinating
Yes,
that you've picked the diametric opposite, which is joy and hope. So talk to us about that, would you?
absolutely. Yes, just to make sure it's clear, I am looking at joy in terms of eucatastrophic joy. So that kind of feeling when eucatastrophe brings you realize the darkness has ended, something new, something good is beginning. Um, Absolutely. we can't go back. You know, the characters in the Lord of the Rings, for example, lives have been lost,
Mm,
homes have been destroyed, there, you know, trees have been cut down, and those things are going to, some things of those cannot be recovered, and some of those are going to take time to recover. So, you know, it's always got that tinge of sorrow in it.
mm,
Um, and I would never want to say either that Tolkien's characters hope for a eucatastrophe. That's contrary to what a eucatastrophe is. By nature, they are unlooked for. But I do believe that hope comes about in part because eucatastrophes can happen. So if there's good, we can reasonably expect that sometimes persevering, waiting, means you will see that joyous change come about. Specifically in Middle Earth, that Athrobeth quote that I mentioned with Finrod makes it really clear that just that because Arrow has designed Arda to fit into his perfect plan for the ages, not even Melkor's Discord can change that. Everything is fitted into this perfect, beautiful music. So Finrod states that he trusts, he hopes that even if circumstances are hard at some points, there's still joy ahead. He can always look for the joy.
mhm.
So that combination, I think, is seen throughout Tolkien's fiction and some of the things I pointed out, and especially in some of the circumstances I've mentioned from The Lord of the Rings, where joy and hope, well, we don't know for sure where they're coming from. There's always that little glimmer of light, like Sam looking up at the star.
Right. Oh, yeah, which is one of my favorite moments. Uh,
Yes, mine too.
but if Tolkien didn't give us those moments of joy and hope, and it really was all about death and loss, it would be a grim read, wouldn't it?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Um, okay. Here's another thing I want to ask you. The
Mhm.
White Tree of Gondor. This comes up at several points in your thesis.
Yes.
So why do you think Tolkien invested so much meaning into one single plant?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. It did come
Really
up
is.
a lot. And at first, I only thought of it in certain ways. But then as I kept reading, kept researching, I was like, oh, it keeps coming up over and over and over. I suspect some of that may have been unintentional on Tolkien's part. We might just be seeing kind of his this spilling over of his love for trees to make it such a significant symbol. But as we know that Tolkien was also very intentional and did a lot of rewriting, a lot of thinking about what he put in. So I can also see there are a lot of intentionality there. So he often talked about all of his work as the tree of tales, and each story was its own little leaf. Um, and the white tree is definitely involved in Middle Earth throughout all of its time. It begins even in the Silmarillion because the White Tree of Gondor is an indirect descendant of the trees of Valinor, which I would have to say are probably the most important trees in all of Arda, because what happens to the two trees has ripple effects throughout all of Middle-earth and all of its time. It's also tied closely into Numenor and to Elendil and Isildur, and to the founding of the Kingdom of Gondor, all of which play really big roles in the background to what's going on in The Lord of the Rings, and even to some degree in The Hobbit. It's even tied to Sauron, I thought, because he attempted to get rid of the original White Tree in Numenor and caused Isildur to take one of its fruits to Middle-earth. So it serves also as a direct symbol of Gondor. They have, you know, the heraldry of Gondor all displays the white tree, but and symbolically, it also matches up closely with how the kingdom is faring and with the line of the kings. So the previous white tree, the one that we see standing in the courtyard when Gandalf and Pippin arrive in Minas Tirith, hasn't bloomed or grown since the end of the previous king. And then we see when Aragorn returns, of course, that reverses. Um, it's it's interesting to me to see the contrast too between Denethor and Faramir and their reaction. Denethor completely ignores the tree. He doesn't seem to care about it. It almost seems like the whole idea of the return of the king is highly offensive to him. And yet Faramir looks at it completely the opposite, and we get the impression that a lot of other people in Gondor view it the same way, that it's a symbol of hope, that he says, I want to see it in flower again in the courts of the kings. And that corresponds very closely to how they respond to the entire situation. Denethor responds with complete despair. He gives up. And Faramir perseveres, and he sees those realization of his hope. And as I said a moment ago, it's Aragorn's first way of claiming the throne. When he shows up at Minas Tirith, he's displaying the standard that Arwen made with the white tree on it. And then when he finds the new white tree and it blooms for him, that's a symbol of the positive change that's going on in Gondor. And he takes it as the sign that, all right, yes, things are going to happen the way I thought. It's his hope that he's going to see a better future from here on out.
Mm-hmm.
So choosing a tree, I think trees are often symbolic already of the idea of new beginnings, of growth. And so it's hard to think of something that could be a more appropriate symbol to be so central to Tolkien's stories than a tree.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. That moment where Aragorn finds the sapling and it comes from the ground easily to his hand as if it was barely and it's planted and it blooms for him. As you say, this is a really symbolic moment. Do you think it's also symbolic of a reforging of the connection between Gondor and the West? Because that, of course, was the connection for Numenor. It was a gift from the elves in the West.
That's
I
true.
wonder if it's a reforging of that relationship. What do you think?
That does seem to make a lot of sense. I hadn't viewed it in quite that way, but it does make sense, especially given that Aragorn uses that as a symbol that to himself that his marriage with Arwen is going to take place. They've been planning for decades, but he wasn't sure if he would get to that point. And
Mhm.
so again, the marriage of Aragorn to an elf would also kind of be a little picture of maybe the even though the elves are sort of fading out of Middle Earth, and they will, over the next decades after the conclusion of Lord of the Rings, they'll be heading to the West. Um, they that there's still this brief resurgence of
Mhm.
that, and yeah, I could see the white tree also symbolizing that, since again the strong connection to Numenor, and then the connection of the original white tree in Numenor back to Valinor itself.
Frankly, I think we could sit here and talk about just the white tree for the next 20 minutes.
Oh,
Uh,
probably so.
but we should move on. Okay, so like every student who completes their thesis, you've put in hours and hours of research, um, some of which, of course, will never find its way actually into your thesis. But the background to the
Mhm.
writing of any thesis is the many, many hours of research. So, as you were researching, did you come across anything that surprised you, or anything that you were um, really not anticipating finding?
Yeah. I would say the biggest surprise was definitely that no one seemed to have really done this before.
Mhm.
I went into this topic, started researching it with the expectation I would find a lot more existing scholarship than I did. There's lots of wonderful scholarship on different parts of this. You can find some really interesting information on Tolkien and trees, Tolkien and plants in general. You can even find some really fun articles where people have taken some of Tolkien's fictional plants and done scientific analyses of them. I enjoyed those. Um, and you can find some on Eucatastrophe, and less on Estel, less on the concept of hope. Um, but I was mostly surprised to see that this was not something that had been widely covered. I found little mentions of particularly the Ents being used as a eucatastrophic agent, But yeah, that was the biggest surprise of all, was just that these pieces hadn't really been merged before. Um,
So unusually, the surprise for you was the lack rather than
yeah,
finding something in particular.
yeah. I would also say one thing that was just kind of a small thing that I thought was interesting was that there isn't really a count out there of how many plants exactly Tolkien invented.
Hmm.
And it seems like you would just, I expected to, type that into a Google search and get a number. But that's not what happened. It's not very straightforward. I think there's several reasons for that. One is that some of them are barely mentioned, um, and they're just kind of out there, and we don't have a lot of information about them. And some of them, he changed the descriptions over time, or they're used in slightly different ways. And Tolkien loved names, and he loved giving things lots of names. And so sometimes it's a little unclear if maybe a different name is the same flower from a different culture or a different language. And so it actually becomes surprisingly hard to calculate how many plants Tolkien actually created. That was kind of a fun, interesting thing that was a surprise to me.
Oh, I can imagine that being a rabbit hole that you dive down into.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so like I said, you did many hours of research, and some of the stuff that you research inevitably doesn't find its way into your thesis because there is a
Mhm.
limit on how much is actually allowed to go into the thesis. So, was there anything that you wanted to include, but you had to leave it out, or an aspect that you really wanted to pursue, but you couldn't because of the constraints?
Huh. Um, I would say one of those is probably what we were just mentioning. It would be really interesting to go down that rabbit hole and chase down more information. What is there to be had about what the Tolkien's fictional plants? There are a few really prominent ones that tend to get a lot of the attention. Athelas, Malorns are definitely at the top, but there's not a lot of detail on them. I would love to go back and spend more time in the Flora of Middle Earth, by Walter and Graham Judd, and they have attempted to do some work in that area, and I would love to see more. Um, and and correspondingly, I think I would also love to spend more time studying out exactly what species of plants Tolkien uses in different areas, especially if you start reading back over the passages where, like, the hobbits are walking through the Shire to the Old Forest, and through it, as Frodo and Sam are walking through Ithilien, Tolkien just names plant after plant after plant, some of which I don't even know what they look like. I and I would love to go back and spend a lot more time on that and go, okay, why did he choose those ones? And what significance do they have? I firmly believe he picked each one carefully to give just the right shape. And so that would be a really interesting topic. I think my favorite one, and maybe I will pursue this in the future, is I would love to spend more time with Tom Bombadil and Treebeard together, and see how they correlate to one another. They're both very associated with nature. They're both a little bit mysterious, and they both have these these roles of interacting with the hobbits that create ripple effects that expand through the whole story, and yet they both sort of just disappear at the end.
Mhm.
And I would really like to spend some more time studying out both of those characters, how they're similar, how they're different, and how they relate to the story.
And they both have a rather laissez-faire attitude to the goings-on of Middle-earth as well.
That's true. That's true.
We hear in the Council of Elrond that there's no point in giving the ring to Tom Bombadil, even though it doesn't affect him, because he just wouldn't know why you've done that, and he'd probably end up losing it, which wouldn't be very helpful. And then, of course, towards the end of The Return of the King, Treebeard just lets Saruman go,
Hmm.
because he doesn't see the point of holding on to him, even though Gandalf would have very much preferred if he had kept Saruman under lock and key for at least a little bit longer. And of course, the fact that Treebeard doesn't do that means that Saruman is free to leave and then create damage and destruction and mayhem in the Shire. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think there's quite a lot to be said about that. You know, why this kind of laissez-faire attitude? What does it say about how removed they are from the pettifogging things that go on in Middle
Hmm.
Earth? What does that say about their actual function? Again, I think we could be here for half an hour talking about just that. I smell a conference paper in there. That sounds like a really interesting topic.
Maybe I'll go there.
Hint, hint. Okay, so one of the things I always like to ask my
Mhm.
students when they finish their thesis theatre and finish the entire process, because it is a long process that takes many, many months to achieve. There are always a significant number of Signum students who are coming towards that point where they are choosing their topic and they're about to embark on the entire thesis process. So I always like to ask, what advice might you give to a thesis student who is about to embark on their thesis process? Something you've
Mhm.
learned from your own experience of the process that you could pass along?
Yeah, I think probably the number one thing I would say is because you're going to be working with this so intently and for quite some time, you should pick a topic you're going to love. As much as you possibly can guess that this is something I'd really like to look into. It's that one scene that sparked your interest, or it's that curiosity about a word or a poem or an element of language, and you're just like, oh, that was just interesting to me. I found that fun, or very curiosity provoking. So I would say first, my biggest piece of advice would pick something that you're going to really like working on because you're going to be spending a lot of time with it. And um, I thoroughly enjoyed this. The more I got into it, the more I realized I loved it. And that was a great deal of pleasure for me to be able to work on something that was so interesting to me personally. I would say that the second major thing I would say is when you're starting, you go ahead and think about your time management. From a very practical aspect, as soon as you start, read over the syllabus, look at the due dates, look at the pieces that are going to be coming your way over the next 2 months. And as much as you can, for me, I'm a planner and I loved having an idea of, okay, I know I can work about this fast. I have these other responsibilities in my life. And just kind of getting a rough idea of how I should pace myself from the very beginning was really helpful. Um, you ha you'll have to be flexible. Flight plans can change course. But starting out with a rough idea of where I wanted to spend my time was really helpful, and I would recommend that to others as well.
Two very wise pieces of advice there, Kimberly. I think that first one, pick something you love, I think is so important because it is very hard to spend the length of time that you do spend with your topic if it's not something that really fires you up. So I completely
Mhm.
agree with you. And the time management thing is so important too. So thank you very much. I think those are two really, really good pieces of advice for up
You're
and
welcome.
coming thesis students. And that brings our thesis theatre to a close. And as it brings our thesis theatre to a close, it brings Kimberly's thesis journey to a close. And I'm always delighted to be the one to say congratulations, first of all, to a student who
Thank
has
you.
worked extremely hard over the last many, many months, has produced a lovely piece of work that I really hope she will do something else with and develop further and get something published from it because it is a fascinating topic. And I think there would be a lot of interest outside of Signum as well as inside Signum on that. Because you have indeed passed your master's degree, Kimberly. You get to this point and you have passed, but it is always a delight for me to be the first to tell you that you are now completely done. Congratulations. The
Thank you
very
very much.
last thing you will have to do is graduate.
All right.
Okay, I want to thank everybody who came to watch this. I want to thank people who will be watching this as a recording. I want to thank Kimberly for trusting me to help her through this process and for being such a fantastic thesis student and doing a beautiful piece of work that both I and her second reader truly enjoyed reading. So thank you very much to you, Kimberly.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to all of you, my teachers, and especially to Dr. Brown for guiding me along the way. It's been a true joy to be part of the Signum family.
Wonderful, but you are still a member of the Signum family. You will always be a member of the Signum family. So I hope that you will maintain your contacts with us in the years to come. Okay, everybody, that's everything from us. Thank you again for joining us, and I will hopefully see you again soon in a future Thesis Theatre. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.